right, welcome back to another episode of the Modern Cyber Podcast, brought to you by Firetail. As always, I am your host, Jeremy. And today we've got somebody who is coming from a little bit of a different stage of their life and their career. And I'm really looking forward to getting into some of his experiences and some of the wisdom and the lessons learned over a really long and illustrious career. I am joined today by none other than Steve Stratton. And Steve has far too many qualifications and accolades and so on to get into, but a few things I will share. Stratton served in the military at White House Communications and as a Special Forces Senior Weapons and Communications Sergeant. He joined the U.S. Secret Service, then left to support the warfighter and intel community by developing software solutions to access and transfer classified data and information. Steve has, I think, more credentials and degrees here than I'm really used to seeing from our guests, but a BA in management, DEC computer and networking courses, Sun Microsystems, Novell, Cisco. I know some of these are vendors that we don't really hear about too much anymore today, but Special Forces, U.S. Army Intelligence, U.S. Army Combat Medic. I don't know where you found the time to get all of that in, Steve, but thank you so much for taking the time to join us today.
Thank you for having me. I was somehow got 26 hours in a day back then when I was younger. I don't remember how, but it was crazy.
So the physics has kind of morphed for you now in retirement, as I understand it.
Oh, yeah. Well, I thought retirement would slow me down, but with advising, consulting, and then writing books, it's my wife and I sort of have to check in, and she's trying to retire from her business, so it's crazy. Fun, yeah. Crazy, though. Good crazy.
Okay. Well, at least good crazy. That's what we like to hear. What I want to get into today is really kind of, as I said at the top of the show, learning from some of the experiences and the lessons learned over a career spanning the length of time that you did, because really a lot of change happened, I think, over the course of your career, right? We went from mostly analog and maybe just a few digital systems owned primarily by nation states to now everybody, including multiple devices in your pocket with you at all times. That must have been a massive technology landscape change to work through over those years. And I'm just curious, are there any kind of high level things that really struck out to you as threads or as topics and themes through that transition?
Yeah, number one is being open to change, right?
Okay.
Not all change is good, but like going from big fat cables as thick as my thumb to ones thinner, then all of a sudden Wi-Fi and Bluetooth and other things like that. My adaptability to change and then to understand a bit about the technology and figure out why it might be useful was really helpful. So fighting change, it's like, the whole futile line.
Yeah.
So change is going to happen around you, digital transformation as we call it now. And you really have to understand it as you place it in your workspace, right? What's important to you.
Yeah. So you must have seen the emergence of some of the earliest cyber threats and some of the first kind of cyber attacks over your career as well, right? What were those experiences like?
Well, there was the Mitnick, so just plain up social engineering. I did it too. I didn't even smoke. Go out back where the smokers were, ask for a cigarette, chat people up. Next thing, people are inviting you in. There were attacks that actually took advantage of printer memory back in those days with the big old green bar printers. And then one of the more famous ones I was involved in working was a Citibank hack where a young lady asked a VAX administrator, I really enjoy this and I want to learn this system. Could I get an account? And $10 million later, Citibank's wondering where their money went. So, those days, there just wasn't as the technology has gotten better, it's also gotten more complex and therefore leaving more opportunity for things that aren't so physical maybe anymore. But phishing is just another kind of, instance of that kind of social engineering, right?
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
The old thing in a new way. So,
yeah, it's funny. I just got finished with one of Kevin Mitnick's books about 2-3 months ago. And on the one hand, I found myself with a similar thought to you in the sense that I was listening, or I did it as an audiobook, and so I was listening through some of the stories. And I'm thinking, wow, that's just a ton of effort, call after call and pretense after pretense into, the phone companies and the police and the DMV and all the organizations that he went back to again and again. I think the IRS was another one that he used pretty frequently to gather information. And on the one hand, I was like, well, that sounds crazy exhausting. But then on the other hand, I was like, oh, you're right. It is just kind of, the back then equivalent of phishing and fleshing this information out of people through things like forged web forms and web pages that would be gathering the same information back to whoever's going to utilize it. So I think you're right about that. It really is just kind of the evolution. And I'm curious, as we've seen these attacks, and we've seen everything from printer memory, VAX, social engineering, phishing, etc. I work for a cybersecurity vendor. We build a product around API security. But I know one of the things that you've mentioned is that, by and large, a lot of cybersecurity companies or vendors, let's say vendors, kind of fail the customers in many ways. Where does that, what is that opinion? Talk to us about that.
Sure. Well, I was part of the crowd that wanted to build you a best of breed system. And, we ended up with 13, 15, 18 different products that you would pay me handsomely to cobble together, glue together, right? And on the one hand, I think vendors are very focused, right? They've got to be to have a sellable product in the market. Your company focuses on API. The companies I've worked for lately have focused on this cross-domain space. And so you differentiate yourself, but oftentimes what can happen is that how it gets implemented and would operate in the larger picture, right, of a customer. So oftentimes I see that software vendors don't have strong consulting kind of input into the building of their product. How's this actually going to work in the environment?
Right.
How's it going to work if I've got Splunk or, QRadar or different products, right? And so, it's not that their products are failures because they address a certain part of security, right? You address APIs, somebody addresses web, other things like that. It's that how's it going to operate, and then how do I make it simple to operate? And it can interconnect with my SIM and other tools. And so we went from that whole best of breed to, thankfully now we're starting to see more platform thoughts, more focus on certain APIs and sort of common ways to interconnect and collect all this data, right? Then make use of it, right? So.
Yeah, look, I think that's a really good point. And I think every vendor, maybe ourselves included, we would love to think that our customers are going to be in our product all day, every day. But I don't think that's the reality of how people work, right? Because, very rarely is it the case that you're selling a product that is designed to be, the 8-hour-a-day product utilization, right? You're really kind of looking out for threats as and when they emerge within a customer's organization. That can be, let's say in our case, that can be during the development lifecycle of an API, or that can be, in the production environment where the API is utilized. And really the reality is it should really just sound an alarm when something goes wrong. But I think to your point, that alarm has to be in the place that they're going to do their job day to day. So, your product is there running, doing its thing, and your customer is kind of living in Slack or Teams or email or whatever it is that they're using really for kind of ongoing communication, or maybe they pick tickets off a queue or whatever. But you got to kind of feed them in the environment where they're going to be working. Is that kind of the gist of what you're saying?
Exactly. And then allow them to understand, help them understand that, and this is maybe where their onboard consultant, whoever that might be, would help them understand, okay, where should that flow in priority? Because with a product like yours, the more you can do, of course, in production or development, it's like the harder you train, the less you bleed in war. So the more we focus on security first, when building or integrating systems or building new software, the less time we're going to spend on the backside. But then placing it into that, helping a customer, a good sales team right? You've got a salesperson and a sales engineer, and they're showing the product, getting a technical win, then looking at funding and all that kind of stuff. And what I really find helped our customers all through my career was to come in and talk about, okay, how will this overlay into your environment? What would that mean, right? When a range of things are going on, and for example, if somebody's using your products, to help support the Paris Olympics, and they're getting 4 million hits a day, people trying to probe and attack their system. How does that fit in? And so some of those higher level CTO, senior engineering discussions can be really helpful for a
Yeah.
customer to understand that context, because you've checked all the technical boxes. They like the idea. They've seen it. Thank goodness they've seen a gap and they need your product. And so what's that next step in the evolution of how they make use of it and create the ongoing value from your product?
Yeah, yeah. I think that makes a ton of sense, and it's such a valuable point that I really think vendors probably need to keep in mind a little bit more than they do when they're actually building those products. So I want to take a turn for a second and talk about a domain that I know you spend a lot of time in around cross-domain solutions. For those who aren't familiar, including myself, what does a cross-domain solution mean, and what's the problem that it tries to solve?
Right. So the NSA is actually the Department of Defense's security team.
Okay.
And it's a Department of Defense agency, the NSA. And there's another organization called DISA, we call
Yep.
it. And
DISA.
they're like,
Yep.
right, they're the IT managers, network managers, but NSAs are cybersecurity experts in the DoD, for example. And so they defined a need early on, and it was a whole we called it the Rainbow Series. There's like 16 books on all these subjects on how to improve the security of systems that were controlling the interfaces between networks that shouldn't touch.
Okay.
Right. So in the military, we have essentially three types of networks. There's lots of networks that go to coalition partners and things like that. But we have what we call the unclassed network, NIPRNet, the secret, and the top secret, just in general terms. And
Yep.
so there was an early model that was built saying you could move data up, but you can't move data
Move
down,
it
kind of
down.
idea. Yeah, yeah. And so that interface between those, they started to define these products. And they come in two flavors. One is an access product that allows you to connect to one or more of those networks, and you can see into those back-end VDIs, RDP, whatever you've got going, Citrix, VMware, whatever. You can see into those back ends, and you can use in that window on your screen, you can use all those systems, and you could get like in the military intelligence, you can get drone feeds, you can get audio, all that, but you're in that window and you can't cut and paste, you can't drag and drop. So those are access systems. They give you access only. Then there's a second, which is called transfer systems, and they're the ones that inspect the data when it's going low to high, and also in rare cases when data is allowed, like we allow intelligence officers to send the warfighter at the secret level data. So for the intelligence brief, they will do what's called downgrade it, make sure they're not letting any sources or James Bond type information out, and then they'll
Right.
send it down through a controlled interface. And the big difference is we talk about high assurance all the time, that it's a very predictable, repeatable process that will either do exactly what it says or it will fail.
Okay.
So, for example, in a guard, you will actually set up a security policy saying, I am looking at this XML data or this data stream, and if it doesn't exactly match this, if there's one bit out, right, we're going to throw it away. And
Yeah.
so, right, so there are transfer systems that will transfer, right, streaming data is easy because it's fixed format. It's the Word documents, the PowerPoints, the embedded everything documents that need further inspection. So we end up taking them all apart, checking the parts, checking, for example, for white font, right, hidden stenography, all these kind of things. So I hate to use my bank as a great example, but when Capital One in your area, right up there at the
Yep.
Beltway,
Yep.
suffered that attack, if they'd have had one of those transfer devices watching what was going to the cloud and back, they could have, ensured that it was only that data, had a higher assurance that it was only going to be that data that they approved, that they expected to go up and go down.
Yeah.
And so that is and there's a lot more to it, but it takes about a year and about $1 million, over $1 million to test one of these systems to prove that it does what it does.
Yeah, you bring up an interesting point here, and I've heard this phrase "high assurance" around, I guess, data classification in particular, and around kind of the transfer of data. It sounds like between these domains and the different levels of classification. Do you think that is a paradigm that is easy for non-public sector, for private sector organizations to understand and to embrace?
I think the big problem, I'm not sure that it's hard to embrace, but the biggest problem is cost.
Okay.
By a huge factor. So in the military, for example, in the services, let's say, the Army, where I came from, these devices are few. There's enough to do the work and keep the mission running and keep people safe. But they are few because they are such high threat interfaces. And if I was to try and do high assurance in every step of every place in my architecture, it would be very costly, right? I'd be doing testing, just on every little bit. And the nice thing is with zero trust, if I start to use microsegmentation with some diodes or other things, we can have some good effects where I can build these communities of trust, right? Mm-hmm. Like with zero trust, and apply different levels of security. So if it's the CFO and the business plan, or it's the customer database, I can apply higher level security there. And then inside of customer service, the help desk, maybe I don't have to. The database that they're searching, yes, and I think that's something I don't hear a lot about zero trust itself, is that you really start to talk about that, understanding your data and labeling it, whether it's 1 to 10, green to blue, whatever it is, different sensitivity. So you apply the higher level security at that high threat point, not just across the board, where it would just be uncostly and your board if you're a CISO, your board might laugh at you. So.
But it's really an interesting point because, I understand government does it because it has to, especially across some of these, activities like intelligence gathering, national security, et cetera. And yet when I talk to private organizations, they all have the concept of, well, we've got our data, but then we have our crown jewel data, the things that are really most critical to the organization. And for some, that might be the CRM. For others, it's like their intellectual property or their code or whatever it may be. And yet rarely do I see, to your point, a kind of a different level of data classification, or then, let's say a different level of data handling associated to that data. So there's got to be some lessons that organizations can learn around that, from taking, let's say, the good aspects of how it changes the way that you relate to the data. But I don't know if it's possible to do that without bringing on, to your point, the cost that it brings associated to it. Are there any kind of like lessons learned or any kind of views that you formed in looking at this paradigm over time where you're like, what, we could actually shift that. And if you simplified it down to, let's say, crown jewel, not crown jewel, and you only have 2 levels, then maybe it's really easier. Or I don't know. I'm just kind of wondering what your observations are.
Yeah, certainly. It's interesting. There's a lot of international governments that are internet and government, right? And they don't have all that strata. Maybe some little portion of their military does, but like in Singapore, it's all the internet-based data they have, and then there's some sensitive government data. So the idea that you could use one of these controlled interfaces, these transfer devices, and I would throw in a diode, right? Because that way, if some code gets in, it can't call home. It makes the code go one way. And you can use a separate guard. I would use a separate transfer device from a different maker on a different hardware platform. Diversity helps. If they break one system, they can't, they're not automatically breaking the other one. And I would protect at that level. Like on the Maryland side where all the big pharma is and the gene coding and all that, right?
Yeah.
That intellectual property about that next billion-dollar drug they're working on is pretty sensitive.
Yeah.
So that's where I get nervous because firewalls are nice and we use them horizontally in the government, but we're not using them as strong enough security to like, even have access within organizations, right? So we use
Yeah.
firewalls and other sort of standard, whether if you're using Cisco, the security you can put in at the network level, all that kind of stuff. We're doing that
Yeah.
horizontally and even
Yeah.
now starting to implement zero trust. But that's not enough right. That's just hasn't proven enough to protect the crown jewels. And
Yeah.
there are ways to further isolate that capability so people can get access, and then you only transfer exactly what you think you're going to transfer out, what you need out.
Hmm.
And so, but it does take a different mindset, right? Than, okay, I'm going to use the Palo Alto, what I call platform now, and
Yeah.
have all these products that they've got, plug your product in. I'm going to have this good baseline, and then I'll just sort of, through authentication and stuff, identity, I'll just sort of restrict access over here. Because we have seen
Yeah.
so many times that once the bad guys get in, going horizontal doesn't prove so hard for them, right?
Right. Right.
Once they've got one set of credentials, then getting horizontal is not so hard. So
Yeah. And
I think
it's,
there's some good lessons to learn without having to go to the full we're protecting lives, like secret to top secret kind of
yep.
thing.
Yep. Yep. Yeah. And it's interesting because, when you think about kind of like two types of controls that you mentioned there and that we can think about, one is, of course, network control, and the other one is identity-based control. We're actually increasingly living in a world where all infrastructure is software defined, and it's actually easier than ever to add these layers of controls in. If you've ever spent time designing a VPC on AWS, you know that you've got, I think, 5 or 6 different filters and control types that you can add between subnet to subnet. And you can very easily define a hierarchical structure where you go from a less privileged to a more privileged subnet through both network controls and identity controls. And so, I think that point that you raise about thinking about it, okay, in this way really makes a ton of sense. It leads me to my next question, which is, if government's been thinking about this for a long, long time and they've been implementing systems like this, is there some level of government that is actually ahead of private organizations in terms of cybersecurity? Because, like, the common wisdom that you'll hear is, oh, government, they move so slow, they're behind, they never have the latest and greatest. And here in the Beltway area, it's this kind of colloquial thing about everybody who wants to go after public sector. It's a 3-year slog before you win any business and you start really having anybody using your product. I don't know. You must have seen both sides of this over your time, right?
Right. Both being in the government and then as a contractor to the government,
Yeah.
looking at and investigating these kind of products. And it really, on this high end of assurance, the government leads, the NSA's, there. So like I say, literally for one of these transfer devices that does structured data, it's not even looking at, Excel spreadsheets and docs and everything that can be embedded in all the Word, and
Yeah.
stuff like that. Or
Yeah.
the amount of time the NSA will take, it's a solid 9 months of testing, 3 months of documentation, outbriefs, all those kind of things, a whole chunk of money. But then you get assigned a risk rating. So even after that, the NSA may say, well, you could use this product, but you've got to do these things in the network or
Right.
set it up a certain way. So
Right.
it's not like it's the products are no risk. They're just reducing the risk more than a traditional commercial product can at this point.
Right.
And I
Right.
often, when I was still working, I was talking to several folks, like in the firewall space, that we could take some of this code that we use and make it a sidecar, because they do a lot of marketing around the fact that they do a lot of inspection, but that lot of inspection is only so far into the stack, right? It's not into the data stream. So at least it was when I was still working. And so there's opportunities for some of these companies to pick up on that with some of
Mm-hmm.
these vendors who've got these pieces of code that could, because a company I was at when we came together, we actually ended up with the old Sidewinder firewall,
Mm-hmm.
and then actually a finished firewall. So it we looked at actually applying a sidecar, and so because we use sidecars in the transfer devices, like there'll be a sidecar that will check a specific, like Word documents.
Mm-hmm.
There's companies that'll take it all apart, do that for us. So we didn't have to build that code. As the head of product management, I could partner and save us time and cost instead of building code. And so there's definitely opportunity. The one problem that commercial has is that often these products are ITAR restricted, and that means that only U.S. personnel can operate them. Now, you and
Mm-hmm.
I anybody can use the data that goes back and forth, but the person who touches and manages that system has to be a U.S. citizen. It's an international traffic and arms regulation. It's like, wait a
Right,
minute, this is
right.
not a rifle or a missile going to Ukraine, but it's the level of sensitivity about the code. And so that has been historically has been a roadblock. But a lot of a lot of the vendors are starting to make commercial versions of these products. And great example, there was a television organization, a broadcasting organization, I should say, that broadcast a very serious event and was really worried about that transfer from production into transmission. And they were very seriously, we were a little bit late to this big event that they do yearly, and so didn't get put into the system, but they were very interested in that controlled interface and knowing that that's the only thing that's going into the transmission system,
Mm-hmm.
aka somebody can't take over the transmission system through this route. So the
Yeah.
opportunity's there, and I think the other thing that is has been interesting over the course of my career is also seeing the startup of because I worked with Chubb way back on and talked to them about cybersecurity insurance.
Uh-huh.
So oftentimes, right, organizations will say, "Well, I'm going to spend this much on cybersecurity. It's good from a legal perspective. We're doing what we can, and then I'll insure for the rest." Right? They're not going to
Right.
triple their budget because insurance is cheaper. So interesting byproduct of the market that you know you don't have unlimited as a CISO, you don't have an unlimited budget. There's a certain level to which an organization will go, and then they'll insure for the rest of the potential threat.
Yeah, I think this insurance question, look, when you boil it down, and I've had this conversation on the podcast with many people, it's like ultimately you can never 100% guarantee security. And that is true for both physical security as well as cybersecurity. And I've had one guest on the podcast who said to me, the safest computer in the world is the one that's turned off, unplugged, encased in a block of concrete and at the bottom of the ocean. And even then, I'm not 100% sure. Right. And, you could even concoct like James Bond movie type devices that are sonar scanners that can read, I don't know, digits off of a disk and reconstruct a data set in science fiction land or what have you, right? But it is all about kind of risk management and understanding the level of risk that your organization is comfortable with. And then to your point, the insurance is kind of, okay, these are the things that we're going to do that make sense both in terms of we can still operate, but they cover the most likely risks or the risks that we're the most worried about. And then for the unforeseen circumstances, we get insurance. And it's actually very similar to how we think about driving, right? We want everybody to be licensed. We want them to go through a level of training. They need to know how to follow the rules of the road. They should have cars that are inspected, that are safe to operate, etc. And then we have insurance for unforeseen circumstances. So I think seeing the development of that and seeing that develop in the cybersecurity ecosystem has been really, really interesting to watch. I will say, as somebody who has worked primarily in cloud and emerging technologies like cloud and API and so on for the last couple of years, I don't think that the insurance industry has kept, the cyber insurance industry has kept pace with the most modern threats and the ones that are, for instance, leading to some of the largest data exfiltrations and data thefts from organizations. When we look at a lot of cloud breaches, admittedly, many of them are caused by customer error in terms of leaving things accidentally exposed to the internet. And in the case of API breaches, it's almost always somebody leaves an authorization check either incomplete or omitted altogether. These are massive data breaches typically. They expose entire data sets, and they tend to be, kind of 10 to 100 times larger than the average data breach. And I'm not sure that the insurance industry has really appreciated that yet.
Yeah, and isn't it amazing? We talk exactly what you said. We talk that way about the physical world, right? After at a certain, it's like, well, there could be a tornado, but we're in Montana, so it could happen, but the likelihood's not, right? So we take that, and as we got into computer security, information security, cybersecurity, we brought that physical mentality over, like you said, to risk analysis, risk assessment. And then, but similar thing. I mean, 15 years ago, I was at a bank in Texas. They had put out. It was after the Oklahoma City bombing, and they had dolphins out. Their security was top notch, and they were barking about how good their security was. And it was an out of the box password on a Cisco router that let me in a stupid amount of time that they didn't believe, and I had to prove to them that it was human error is still a huge part of that. And I think also something we've addressed lately, or in the last 5-10 years pretty well, has been privileged account, right? Privileged account access, and then also monitoring of privileged accounts, like the whole thing with, now I can't remember his name, but he's still in Russia. You know who I mean, NSA, when he had
Snowden.
access. Yeah, Snowden, when he was a database administrator, and he had access to petabytes of data when it should have been split up. So,
Yeah. Well, Steve, we're coming close. We've got about 10 minutes left in the episode, and I've got two things that I want to talk about still. One is I'd love for you to share with the audience what you write about, because I just looked this up and learned about it, and I'd love to hear more about it. But the other is I kind of want to hear, there was something in your background when it was sent over to me that I thought was really interesting. We see a lot of people coming out of the armed forces into cybersecurity. You went through a similar transition. What is it about that background that kind of, I guess, it brings people or gives people a motivation or an attraction towards cybersecurity? And what was that journey like for you?
Well, back when I joined the Army in '73, I was a radio repairman that actually had to also operate the radios at the White House,
Okay.
and the president traveled all that. And just over time, I went from there to the Secret Service. Now I'm off of radios. Now I'm into security systems. And I remember in 1980 when I left, they were just trying to computerize the physical alarm system around the White House. And it was an IBM project. And so, a month later, I'm on a Commodore 25, VIC 25, or a Commodore 64, I forget. And it's like, computers. Oh, look what we can do, and I just, being a techie and definitely nerd before nerd was the word. I just got into this. I got excited about this new opportunity, and now I ended up being like I said, Novell, DEC, some of this Sun. But along the way, I would just go visit other people, and it's like there was a guy who was working on a security assessment for an IBM mainframe when I was working at one place, and I'm like, what's that? And so curiosity, didn't kill this cat, and that's sort of how I got into information security. I've done several podcasts, and I'm a big proponent of military people going into cybersecurity because, number one, they're used to following SOP, right? Standard operating procedures. They're used to, usually, whether they've been in combat or not, they're used to some stress. And not everybody in cybersecurity has to be, a penetration tester, a hacker. Like I was in product management, gathering requirements, helping, work with the developers. There's just a lot of opportunity. And as you well know, we are critically behind in cybersecurity staff.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I know a gentleman. He was an actual gun shooting ranger. He worked for Ground Branch in the CIA. I mean, these are not techie guys. These are get it done kind of guys. And in New York, he was able to get a mentorship kind of idea that he went through the course for the company and he did well on the final test, and they gave him a job. And now he's like doing, intelligence, cyber intelligence work and stuff like that, and also learning about the systems. So there's great opportunities for veterans, for anybody actually. There's a huge gap between the need and the number of employees, in the space for sure.
Yeah. And I see one of your books over your shoulder there. So I just have to ask, tell us in as much detail as you like. I know you don't want to give the book away, and I encourage everybody to go check it out. But what can you tell us about your writing?
So, when I was in Special Forces, we supported 7 Special Forces down in Colombia, Ecuador, and South America. So I did training missions with the Colombian Army and did counter-drug missions and such. So I used that experience to write a series. My protagonist is Crow Indian. I wanted somebody who thinks differently, comes from a different background than another Navy SEAL. Love my SEAL brothers, but wanted something a little different. And then I put him in harm's way right away. In the first book, he's with his parents in Puerto Vallarta. They're coming back. They're heading back up 15 to Tucson when they stop for lunch, and it was a bad idea to stop for lunch, and his parents get killed. So it's a revenge book. I tell everybody It's really easy to write a revenge book. There's one thing on your good guy's mind. But he comes through it. He goes through darkness. He comes out the other side, and they end up creating a unit around him that is a counter-drug unit. And it's 1998, so I had to remember all the gear we had and didn't have back then. Yeah. So the second book takes place in 2003. Now we're in Afghanistan, and the Taliban's making $400 million off of heroin. And the president says, I need this for my administration. You need to go stop that. So that's the second book. And then yesterday, I released a novella that's called The Warrior's Path. That is the origin story for Lance Bearwolf, my good guy. And and so I've got another book coming later this year. That'll be book 3 in a series. So, if you're interested in El Chapo's not in a Colorado prison in my series, not yet.
Yep.
But he has gotten out of prison more than once. One in tunnels, baskets. He was the master of escape. So that's what the series is about. And thank you for asking. I appreciate that.
Awesome. So it looks like we've got Shadow Tier, and then the one I see over your shoulder there is Shadow Junction, if I read it right.
Sanction.
Sanction. Okay, a little bit of a shadow or a glare there, and then we've got the Warrior's Path as the as kind of the origin story prequel, if you will. Yes. And where's the best place for people who are looking for these? Where should they look to find them?
Amazon for the first 2 books. Any bookseller, just about any bookseller, will have the novella. I need to get the first 2 books up on, a distributor that goes to the, Barnes and Noble and all the other places. And then the third book, Caribbean Harvest, will come out in November timeframe, and that's where Lance and his wife go to Cuba to chase El Chapo.
Okay. Well, we look forward to seeing how that goes. I think you are the 4th or 5th published author that we've had on the podcast, and I always find that it's really interesting to hear, what are the origin stories? What are the little twists? What are some of the inspirations for the work that they put into it? And Steve, it's been great talking to you today. I've really enjoyed our conversation. Remember, for those that are with us in the audience side, you can find Steve's books on Amazon.com as well as his upcoming stuff. Might take a little bit longer to get out there, but it'll be available for you. Steve Stratton, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today on Modern Cyber.
Thank you. It was a real pleasure talking with you.
All right. And for our audience, please remember, sharing is caring. Rate, review, like, subscribe, all that good stuff. And we look forward to seeing you on the next episode of Modern Cyber. Bye-bye.